A U.S. warship seizes an Iranian vessel moving toward the Gulf of Oman. Within minutes, oil jumps, equities roll over, and the ceasefire everyone keeps talking about suddenly looks like a rumor the market no longer believes. That is the scene I want you to hold in your mind, because the real story is not the ship by itself. The real story is what that seizure exposed. Iran is no longer trying only to raise the cost of shipping. It is trying to force the world to see that the physical system and the paper system are not the same thing. That is the warning. And that is why this moment is much more dangerous than it looks. If this were only a military story, Washington would still be on familiar ground. A blockade, a seizure, more statements, more talk about resolve. Fine, great powers know how to speak that language, but Iran is now trying to move the war onto a different level. It is no longer speaking only in the language of ships, missiles, and retaliation. It is speaking in the language of inflation, rates, debt rollover, treasury credibility. And the difference between a commodity the world physically needs and an asset the world financially trusts. That is a completely different battlefield. I want to give you a framework for this, because without a framework, this whole story sounds like chaos. The framework is simple. I call it the physical paper split. America's supremacy rests on paper power, reserve currency status, global demand for dollar assets, the ability to issue debt at huge scale because the world still believes US. Paper is the center of the system. Iran's leverage rests on physical power, oil shipping lanes, choke points, risk to cargo, risk to insurance, risk to refineries, risk to the literal movement of energy through places the world cannot simply replace on command. Most of the time, paper looks stronger than physical power. That is because paper is protected by normality. As long as ships move, as long as crude flows, as long as inflation is under control, as long as central banks still have room, the financial system can keep pretending that paper claims on stability are just as solid as the material world beneath them. Choke point wars strip that illusion away. Because when the choke points start to shake, the physical comes first. You cannot fuel Europe with confidence. You cannot run aviation on sentiment. You cannot move fertilizer, plastics, freight, tourism, industry, and household stability with a treasury auction. You still need oil. That is the heart of the Iranian message. And this is why the seizure matters so much. The market understood immediately that the cargo on one ship was not the main issue. The main issue was that any tighter enforcement in Hormuz means every future barrel now carries more political risk, more insurance risk, more disruption risk, and more inflation risk. That is why oil jumped so fast. And once oil rises sharply in the middle of an already fragile inflation environment, Washington has a much bigger problem than a naval standoff. It has a timing problem, because the American system right now needs lower inflation, easier financing conditions, and room for rates to come down. That is the only comfortable setting for a government trying to manage massive issuance without a deeper confidence scare in the bond market. Iran can see that is why its warning was aimed far beyond the Gulf. It was saying, in effect, you can talk all day about safe assets, but your safe asset system still depends on the uninterrupted movement of physical energy through zones you do not fully control. That is not propaganda in the cheap sense. That is a structural attack. Now bring in the IMF warning. Most people will treat it like just another institutional caution. I think that is a mistake. If the safe haven premium on treasuries is getting thinner, if investors no longer give American sovereign debt the same unquestioned psychological advantage it used to enjoy, then war-linked inflation risk becomes much more dangerous. Because the treasury market is not just a market, it is the financing core of the American imperial system. And if confidence there starts softening, while the administration is also leaning heavily on short-term issuance, the trap becomes obvious. Short-term debt only feels safe if short-term rates do not stay elevated. Short-term rates only come down cleanly if inflation behaves. Inflation only behaves if energy behaves. And energy does not behave when Hormuz is turning into a war zone. That is the chain. This is why I think the Iranian signal is much smarter than most people realize. It is not trying to say Iran is stronger than America in a crude military sense. That would be silly. It is saying something more precise. It is saying America's paper power can still be forced to answer to physical constraints. And if that becomes visible to the whole world, then the cost of this war grows far beyond the military domain. Now widen the map. Hormuz alone is already enough to shake the system. But the real danger is that Iran's leverage does not end there. The moment Mandeb and the Red Sea enter the same strategic conversation, the crisis stops being a Gulf story and becomes a broader global transport story that matters, because once flows are rerouted, compressed, or interrupted through fewer lanes, every downstream node starts to matter more. Pipelines matter more, receiving terminals matter more, pumping stations matter more. Tanker classes matter more, insurance spreads matter more, refinery timing matters more. That is why the jet fuel issue is not some random side detail. It is a warning that product balances can start breaking before policymakers are psychologically ready for them to break. Once aviation, shipping, tourism, and industrial transport begin feeling the same squeeze, the war leaves the Middle East in people's minds. It becomes a global inflation story. And when wars become inflation stories, democratic governments lose room fast. That is especially true for Washington now, because it is already politically boxed in. If it tightens the blockade harder, oil pressure rises, inflation risk rises, and the debt story gets worse. If it eases off, Iran proves that choke point leverage works. If it tries to widen the war to solve the Iran problem once and for all, then the China question moves to the center. And that may be the most dangerous branch of all. Because more and more people in Washington are now saying openly what used to be implied. Maybe the real target here is not just Iran. Maybe the deeper logic is China. Cut Chinese access to Iranian oil, damage Chinese trade, with the Gulf raise Beijing's energy costs, use Middle Eastern chaos to increase pressure on the Chinese economy. On paper, I understand the temptation. In reality, I think it is reckless, because Washington keeps making the same mistake. It keeps treating China as if it were alone. China is not alone. Every serious pressure campaign against Beijing's energy position creates a stronger incentive for Russia and China to integrate faster, not slower. Every effort to squeeze Chinese access to Gulf resources makes Russian substitution more valuable. Every extra layer of war pressure teaches Eurasian powers the same lesson. Root around the American system while you still can. That is the strategic self-harm built into this whole approach. Washington thinks it is isolating enemies. It may actually be teaching them how to consolidate. And if that happens, the war produces two outcomes at once. In the short term, America absorbs inflation stress, debt stress, and market stress. In the medium term, America accelerates de-dollarization habits, alternative settlement systems, and a wider international appetite for anything that reduces dependence on US. Controlled financial plumbing. This is how empires accidentally train the world to leave them. Not by vanishing overnight, by weaponizing their advantages so aggressively that everyone else starts building escape routes. That is why I would not dismiss Iran's warning as just noise. Yes, it is political theater. Yes, it is meant to frighten. But it is also anchored to a real vulnerability. The financial system still depends on a world where paper trust and physical flows remain aligned. Choke point wars attack that alignment. They force inflation higher, complicate rate expectations, make debt management harder, weaken safe haven psychology, and remind the world that there is still no paper substitute for real barrels moving through real maritime corridors. Once that lesson is visible, the question stops being whether America can seize another ship. Of course it can. The real question becomes whether it can protect the pricing logic of its own paper empire while the physical world is moving against it. That is much harder. So, how does this end? There are really only three paths. The first path is that Washington doubles down, tightens enforcement, and tries to break Iran before the financial consequences become politically intolerable. That is the clean fantasy inside the maximalist view, but it assumes the physical system will obey long enough for the paper system to survive the strain. I think that is a dangerous assumption. The second path is that Washington quietly looks for an off-ramp and begins rebranding partial de-escalation as discipline, prudence, or strategic success that lowers immediate stress. But it also tells the region that Iran found the right pressure point. The third path is that the anti-Iran logic broadens into an anti-China logic, and then the war becomes much bigger, much messier, and much harder to control. Not because China collapses, but because Russia backfills, Beijing adapts, and the rest of the world starts adjusting even faster to a future with less faith in American paper dominance. I still think the second path is the most likely, not because Washington is wise, because arithmetic eventually beats rhetoric. Oil is real, inflation is real, debt rollover is real, treasury demand is real, and if the war keeps pushing on all four at the same time, then the American system eventually has to choose between strategic pride and financial stability. Great powers usually posture toward pride until the last possible moment. Then they retreat toward stability and invent a story about why retreat was always strategic. That is the pattern I see here. The true danger is not that Iran suddenly wins some cinematic victory. The true danger is that Iran demonstrates something far more corrosive, that a weaker state sitting next to real energy choke points can force the strongest financial power in the world to defend not only ships and allies, but the pricing credibility of its own paper system. And once that split becomes visible, everybody learns from it, markets learn from it, governments learn from it, China learns from it, Russia learns from it, Europe learns from it, the developing world learns from it. They learn that treasuries are still central, but no longer untouchable. They learn that energy routes can still discipline finance. They learn that a war sold as regional containment can become a global confidence test. And they learn that Washington may still be strong enough to dominate headlines, but not strong enough to keep the material foundations of its system outside the war. That is why this is a fatal warning. Not because America collapses tomorrow, because the logic is cumulative. Every extra week of war raises the cost. Every extra spike in oil raises inflation pressure. Every extra inflation scare raises rate pressure. Every extra rates problem raises debt pressure. Every extra debt problem raises faith pressure. And in the end, strong systems are rarely broken by one dramatic strike. They are weakened by repeated moments when reality keeps forcing the paper to reprice itself. That is what Iran is trying to do. Now, not defeat America head on, force America to defend the paper value of its empire against the physical vulnerabilities of the world. It still depends on. That is a much bigger war than most people think they are watching.